So thank you all for coming. I think you're all in the right place. This Synergy session at the Harris Center. I'm Kathy Newhook. We're very pleased to have two special guests here with us today from the University of Alberta to talk about an issue that's on a lot of minds, I'm sure, with challenges facing the province in terms of population and for rural parts of the province in particular. There are lots of communities looking to reinvent themselves. In terms of the format for the session, we have about 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes for the speaker, and then there'll be plenty of time for a Q&A. With the audience, we also have lots of people watching online, so we'll be passing around this mic, which doesn't amplify in the room, as you can tell, but it's really important because otherwise people online won't be able to hear you. So think of it as a talking stick. If you don't have it, you need it. So if you want to save your questions till afterwards, like I said, there'll be lots of time. So, and people online, if they want to submit questions, can do so by emailing the Harris Center, harriscenter@mun.ca, and we'll be keeping an eye to that and have them read in the room. So without further delay, I'd like to pass it over to our speaker, who is right here. I thought you left for a second. Dr. Kristof Van Assche is a professor in planning, governance, and development at the Faculty of Science, Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, and Faculty of Extension at the University of Alberta. His research partner is also here, Dr. Monica Grootsmacher. She holds a PhD from the Center of Development Studies at the University of Bonn and is currently an adjunct professor and postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Extension, University of Alberta. So I think it's just Kristof at the podium, but certainly Monica will jump in at the Q&A. So it's over to you.
Thank you. Can I be heard well? Okay. All right. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting us. Really appreciate. We also don't pretend that we have miracle solutions, of course. And before I go to the slides, just one or two sentences of introduction. I have worked in a number of different countries. Same for Monica, my wife and esteemed colleague. And the recurring theme is governance. So collectively binding decision taking by not only governmental actors, players, but a variety of others. And our starting point is that this is not something new, that in every community there's some form of governance that is taking place, that it's always multi-level in some way, and that there's always some combination, maybe not perfect, but some combination of participation and representation there. There's a very big clock there, so I don't know why I have this thing here. Anyway, so that is the beginning. And for a number of years, the focus was more on the analysis of governance and of evolving governance, unique governance paths, we say, or we speak of them. But in the last few years, let's say 3-4 years, the interest also has been in strategizing for changing governance paths, in the understanding, again, that there are never miracle solutions and that governance in no form you can imagine would be perfectly adapted to everything. And there's always a history of adaptations that pushed it in a certain direction that makes it always imperfectly adapted to a current situation. So we're going to talk about reinventing communities. And of course, that is already a big word, reinvention, that points at the idea that there is a problem or that something big has to be changed. So we would like to emphasize here from the beginning that the grounding topic of reinvention, in our view, is adaptation or adaptive governance. Things change all the time within the community, in the broader context of the community, in multi-level governance. That adaptation, as I mentioned, is always imperfect. Now, what you find quite often are prescriptions, maybe not for reinvention under that heading or under that name, but quite often for adaptive governance, for success, whatever that might mean, for resilience, for sustainability. So under many of those catchwords, or you could say empty signifiers, there are kind of too easy attempts to turn it into a formula, we would say. in our view, what is the key, the most uh, basic prescription, you could say, is that there is a self reflection in the community and that this self reflection leads to strategy. Yeah, so, not only an external analysis, be it consultants or academics or people from higher level governance, but that there is some form of self analysis that then can inspire the strategizing. Now, if we talk about reinvention and link it to adaptation, then it's not just a standard adaptation, but we're talking about situations where people think we need to do something radical. We need to change more than is usual. We need to do more than changing the rhetoric. We need to do more than hiring a new consultant. We need to do more than maybe writing, a new version of the type of plan we're familiar with, but something different. Now, I would like to draw the attention also to the idea that, okay, when you talk about reinvention, that's already an answer. That's not a beginning of an analysis. Many places don't need it, don't want it. It's not always possible. It has many serious repercussions also. If communities try to reinvent themselves, or if others try to force them to reinvent themselves, then that is going to be put a lot of pressure on the community itself. So not always necessary, not always possible. And a very basic question has to be before embarking on such a strategy: is this the best type of strategy? Huh? So, if we talk about reinvention, I think it's also useful, and this is still very basic, I understand, to distinguish it from just change. Also, it's important, I think, to distinguish it from change, even dramatic, that just happens without an intention and without a coherent strategy. All these things are possible and happen, but we would say, okay, under that name, under that label of reinvention, there needs to be action and intention, a will to change, and not just random change, so something cohesive or coherent. Now, one concept we would like to introduce here from the beginning is that of reinvention path. And the idea of reinvention path comes out of the idea of governance path, in the sense that each community has a unique evolution, not just history, but a unique interplay between actors and institutions, between different forms of knowledge, between different levels of governance too. And it can only be understood looking forward against the background of that uh, evolution. So in governance path, we have to imagine reinvention paths. Now, despite what I mentioned just a minute ago, and uh, seemingly contradicting myself already, so the strategy would have to be based on self analysis. On the other hand, not all the options for reinvention, the realistic options given that particular path, would be visible or observable easily from within. So we're not trying to say that the academics, the higher level government or governance people, the consultants are useless at all. No, they might see something key, really, that the locals do not see. Still, that has to be made part then of something that really feels and looks like a self-analysis for the community itself. At least this is our uh, perspective. So these words of caution are maybe superfluous already. I covered much of that already before thinking that reinvention might be the best way forward. Think, are there other options? Do we need to do this? Because maybe it sounds sexy, but it is going to be painful because it will touch power relations, it will touch identity narratives probably, it will test the kinds of knowledge that are present in the community, and so forth, and so forth. If it is the choice, then we would say, well, it's probably useful to try to map out the options on a continuing basis. And in the next slides, I'll try to explain what we understand by that. So, and again, coming back to the idea of adaptive governance, well, reinvention strategies are extreme cases, or you can say limit cases of adaptation that tell you something about possibilities, mechanisms, but also limits of adaptation. You can reinvent yourself to such an extent that everything collapses. You can reinvent yourself to such an extent that things change to a degree where nobody really recognizes the community anymore, and it is really for different people. Whether that is how bad that really is, that's the next that's the next question again. Oh, okay. So, talking about reinvention paths, still, well, assuming that this is not easy, we can talk about obstacles uh, and opportunities where it's impossible to see all of them in advance, because things will move in different directions. We'll speak of coevolutions. You do something, but it affects a number of other things that you cannot always predict. You use a certain type of plan, people get used to that. 10 years later, you throw in another institutional tool. The effects are very unpredictable because coordination is around that type of plan. So because of that, because of this complex coevolution, you cannot predict it completely. You have to follow step by step, okay, what looks like an obstacle or an opportunity right now. Some can be predicted. And of course, if many communities are kind of similar or similar in certain regards, and there's a long history of discussions about those similarities, then it's not so difficult to predict some of the obstacles and the opportunities. Still, some of the, when we talk about predictions, say it is quite useful to analyze the governance path. Now, if we talk about governance path and coevolution, what is it that coevolves? I mentioned some of these things already. Actors coevolve. If this is true, if you look at one level of governance, and it is also true if you look at the relation between different levels. If the provincial government, let's say Newfoundland, has a history of strong interest, but also strong intervention in local communities. Of course, that relation is also going to shape what you can do at a particular point. These actors of local governments and provincial government, federal too, they shape each other over time. But of course, the most local number, the most local player will probably be more shaped by the other levels than the other way around. Institutions and actors' institutions shape each other over time. And the institutions, we understand different tools of coordination: policies, laws, plans, informal institutions. It's never good to focus just on one of those. If you want to understand how a community evolved, how to look forward, just to look at one type of plans, for example. It's very well possible, many parts of the world, that informal institutions, informal coordination mechanisms were in fact much more important than this law or that plan and so forth. If you look at planning in the United States, well, if you focus too much on plans, you're not going to understand much, because the institutions that have some influence are laws. Most of the plans are just paper plans, maybe 90%, some people would say. This is not a very strange thing. Actors and institutions, power, knowledge, narratives, identities, ideologies, all these things we would consider as elements or features of governance that shape each other over time. If there's a very strong neoliberal ideology for a century in a place that is against planning, that is focusing on very strong, almost absolute property rights, okay, that's fine, that's a choice, but then we have to understand that influence on all the other elements of governance. For example, that if there is a problem that requires some form of planning, it's not going to be easy, because the influence of that ideology has changed all the other elements over time. So some obstacles you can predict, others not. And of course, we have to look at the past again. Some of these obstacles and enablers of reinvention are also legacies from the past. And these legacies from the past can be built into the new or the current development strategy even. So the institutional tools to look forward, we're going to move in this or in that direction, they're usually also shaped by older decisions, by old power relations, by old narratives, old stories, that are built into into the governance. It's also possible that there's influence, direct or indirect, of older strategies by that can be an impact of their failure or their success. We're very happy that a certain comprehensive plan worked 40 years ago, and there's a very famous mayor we associate with that, and the whole community is still basking in the glory of that success. Therefore, every attempt to look forwards now will be coordinated in that way. This is not about being good and bad. This is okay. If you want to look forward, think reinvention, those are features of the governance path to take into account. So we can talk of traces or layerings of old strategies, old institutions also, that can have very unpredictable consequences. I understand, and there's much more expertise about that in this room, of course, that also the institutional history um, in Newfoundland has many examples of that. You know, there's a new form of local government. It's applied here. It's not applied there. Uh, I mean, I'm sure this is something for the discussion. The rural development authorities, you know, they were common. Then they survive in some places, not in other places. Some actors, organizations are abolished, but then, of course, the memory is still alive, or the people who worked in there still alive, and try to maintain some of the good things from these old institutions and these old organizations. Again, none of this is um, uh, in general good or bad. That is not the point. But especially in complicated histories where communities tried many different things, these traces or layerings of old strategies, old institutions can be really quite important to see, okay, how can we move forward? Is it possible to reinvent ourselves? And is that influencing us in a particular directions? So all of this has an impact on ways of looking forward. Yeah. So then coming back to the idea of reinvention, um, can we define categories there? Well, I mentioned each reinvention, in fact, has to follow a unique path inspired by the governance path. At the same time, you can make a few categories, it's a little typology. You can say, okay, it will start from or aim at new actors. We want to bring in that. We want to establish a new type of governmental organization, or it is there. We want to use that as the base to reinvent our community. Or the actor could also be private. We want to bring in a mine, and then we want to create the conditions to bring in the mine, and then we will move forward from there and then see how they want to be involved in local governance and so forth. Is it new institutions? No, we're really focusing on a new plan or a new policy document that we already have, or we want to create it. That is going to be the base for the reinvention. That's another possibility. It's also possible that you want to start with a new narrative or a new story. We're not going to jump on new strategies or plans immediately, but first we want to maybe dislodge some of the old stories that are there. Again, this is not about what I think or not, but that could be a choice also in some communities and a starting point for community reinvention. It could also be new assets, and I come back to that idea of assets in a minute. And importantly, and I think important for the discussions in Newfoundland also, do we imagine this reinvention on the existing base, or do we imagine this from a different starting point already? Yeah? Bigger communities, bigger municipalities, or no municipalities, some new form of regional or sub-regional cooperation. That is also possible. It's possible to take that route. Okay. Now, if we talk about reinvention and reinvention that is slowly unfolding in continuous adaptation to whatever change that is observed, then learning is an important concept. Not only individuals, but also organizations and communities, we can say, learn. They're not all going to school, of course, but there's many different forms of learning. And for our purposes, we would distinguish between learning from the past of our own community, learning from other places, failures and successes, successes and failures, or things in the middle, mixed blessings. Okay, what is that? How mixed is it? Do we want to go for that or not? And in some cases, also learning from theory or even from imagination, literature, art, and so forth. Those examples exist also. Still, we would say good to remember to structure that learning as part of a self-analysis in communities. Self-analysis that can lead then to strategizing. Something that we don't like very much is importing quickly without much reflection best practices. Because very often they don't fit in the receiving context, and very often they're also not so good in the place where they were originally practiced. But people are just very good in packaging and selling them as success stories. Okay. Now I already brought this up: coevolution. Coevolution. So in our view, that means that all these elements of governance, the different actors, institutions, the different levels, power and knowledge, and then different types of knowledge, ideologies, identity stories, forms of expertise shape each other. One more example of that is if you have like one type of activity ingrained for a very long time, say coal mining in other parts of Canada, what you tend to get after a while is then what we call concentration problem. That there's one form of looking forward, there's one type of expertise that is really built into the governance, there's one story that is shared by almost all the players in the community, and that is then guiding the selection of this useful expertise, this useful player, and so forth. And that is also guiding then the selection of people to invite, to hear alternative stories. Like we and Monica was also very much involved there, did research in the Crow's Nest Pass, for example, in southern Alberta. That identity story, we're a coal miners community, was so strong that the only solution for the future was, okay, we want a new coal mine. Yeah, we also want reinvention, but that is a modern coal mine. Okay, maybe not. It's a tricky strategy for sure. So if we really refine the analysis, we would argue then it's easier to say how this coevolution works in detail. What really influences what? What were the really most important drivers and shaping influence in the unique governance path? And that will lead to a better strategy. At the same time, as we all know, this will never be perfect. There's nothing like perfect governance. There's nothing like perfect adaptation. And even with the best analysis, it is impossible to completely predict where to okay, where to go. Now I see that I'm already slow. Maybe I have to skip a few things, but I do want to talk for a few more minutes about assets and then show a few diagrams. Why talking about assets? Well, one reason is that reinvention, community reinvention, is often a search for new assets or rebuilding the community based on new assets. Not a fish, but the beach. Not this fish, but another fish. Not this fish, but 5 different fish. Not the gold, but the other thing. And so forth. Another reason why we bring that up is that this is often presented also as something formulaic. This is how you do asset mapping. This is how asset mapping informs then step 4 of the strategy building, how it informs your strategizing. We would say, yes, important as part of the self-analysis to do something like that, this asset mapping, but we have to understand that assets are a little bit more complicated than just a thing that you find, and that where you already know it has a value. Why is that? Because what constitutes an asset depends always on a perspective and on certain goals that you have, on certain values. It comes out of stories. If we tell a certain story about ourselves, we are a coal mining community. Okay, that's already points already in the direction that the main asset that we're interested in is coal mines, and something derived from that will be something else that we can mine. That's going to be a consequence of that. The strategy itself, if we come up with the reinvention strategy, can also create new assets at the same time, uh, uncover new assets. If in the self-analysis we figure out, okay, what we considered an asset is maybe not so powerful or valuable, this can trigger new analysis, and this can trigger then discovery or construction of new ones. Then again, governance context. What is an asset depends on the governance context. If you're in the Amazon in a little village, remote, and you're a native tribe and you find gold, it's probably not an asset. You're probably screwed. They will probably come. You don't know how to make money of that. You don't know how to get it out of the riverbank. Probably people will come who are also not regulated at all and not interested in your well-being, and so forth and so forth. So what can we do with it right now? That's of course also an important question. Variety of other assets as well. Now, finishing this little story about the assets, these things are changing all the time then. They're going to morph all the time in the unfolding evolution of your community. So we would recommend then, and this is something normative, try to be careful with that, to pay special attention to that, to repeat asset mapping on a regular basis. And not always with the same players, but with different combinations of players. And on a regular basis, rethinking what is an asset, what could be useful to reinvent ourselves. And then to do at the same time what we call virtual asset mapping. That just means looking forward at different options for reinvention. What could be assets if we do that? If we choose strategy A, what could be really useful assets? What could be useful assets if we choose strategy B, and so forth? These two things together, repetitive or iterative asset mapping, virtual asset mapping, would enable us to see more different options and to make the governance system more adaptive. So the basic scheme from analysis, self-analysis to strategy, part of the analysis is asset mapping. Discovery of assets inspires the strategy. Our slightly more complicated version is that, okay, you go from analysis to strategy, but back and forth. You're trying to do something, implementing a particular strategy, but then you figure out, okay, we don't know this, we don't know that, we need new analysis. The asset mapping sees, maybe creates certain assets. They influence the strategy, but it is also possible that these assets already influence the strategy by themselves, because we were using things that already influence the way we are organized. Stories create strategy, stories create assets, values create assets, values create the narrative. I think some of the storylines come together here. When we say here actor institution, that means the governance configuration. That just means the way things are organized right now at one point in time, how decisions are taken in our community at one point in time. Look, often reinvention idea when there is a crisis, or it could also be when there's like a major opportunity. Not sure how to use this. Yes. Construction or, exploration of different options for reinvention. And so these three things are possible strategies for reinvention, each associated with different sets of assets. To go this way, then we have to imagine that this and that can be valuable. Maybe we have to create something that complements it. Then this is step 2 in the evolution. Okay, adaptive governance. What do we do now? Again, repetition of the asset mapping. Is this still valuable, what we thought, or not? Do we need to add something? Are there other things that look valuable, possible for next step for our reinvention strategy or not? And so forth and so forth. So each step, rethink, reconsider what are our reinvention paths. Now, this is too complicated and burdensome to do in each and every case. This links back to the first slides where we said reinvention is not the preferred strategy for each community under every circumstance. This is going to put strain. You can say there's transaction costs. It's probably going to trigger conflict as well. Power relations will be touched, identity narratives will be touched, and so forth. But if the community agrees, yes, we are embarking on such a path, reinvention, then we would argue it is useful to do something burdensome like this, to really go beyond the crafting of one strategic document that then has to guide that reinvention. If I try to summarize it, the main reason just that the world is too complicated and too unpredictable to do something like that, community reinvention, based on one uh, document. You need more complex, more diverse observations. You need adaptive governance. I am taking too much time, so I will skip a few things. Uh, the PowerPoint will be shared, I think, so if you want, you can look at it and just show this one. Yeah. Um, this takes a step back again. It's a little bit more generic. It doesn't talk about the asset construction anymore. But here just shows in a nice little diagram how the self-analysis and the strategy and the implementation can adapt to each other over time and then lead to different governance strategies. It's not necessarily the most wise or persistent thing to do, or the most wise thing to do, just to persist in that. You know, that applies to research. Yeah, but we have to follow the method, and then good research comes out of that. Well, no, probably you have to change the method too. Same for governance too. Therefore, all the attention we try to pay to adaptive governance and reinvention in the context of adaptive governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristof. That was super interesting. Let's see about some questions. Does anyone have any questions to get started? I'll pass around the mic. First out of the gate. Introduce yourself for people in the room.
Hi, I'm Carrie Neal. I'm a student here. Thank you for your talk, Kristof. It was really interesting. I'm curious if you have any specific examples of a community that you saw like successfully reinvented itself and one that maybe did not do as well, and why.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, well, yes. Sticking to Canada, Monica and I, and also our colleagues in the team, there were other people involved. We were positively impressed with. Sorry, I do remember it. Positively impressed with Revelstoke in BC. Not just because it reinvented itself in a way that is really quite successful, however you want to measure it. So they were dependent on big construction project. They were dependent in the beginning, very beginning, on mining, then later on railroad, fixing the wagons and so forth. And another reason why we like that is because they did not follow the book at all. And in fact, they took a route that would be criticized by many of the colleagues. I mean, people talking about community development, about planning and so forth. I'll try to be more straightforward here. You could say that they were not democratic at all. There was basically a small group of people that had the trust of the community. You can say an elite, a local elite, that came up with an idea in the late 70s. No, we don't want to get rid of the forestry. We don't want to be just a tourism community. We want a package of different activities, but we're not going to turn that into a formal strategy. We know this is what we want, and for the tourism, we want to start with winter and build summer tourism on that. For the winter tourism, we want to start with a small ski slope, and we want to invest even in that as a municipality. and then use that as bait to attract a bigger fish, a big resort. That worked, but it took 30 years. And all that was informal. None of that was on paper. And what you could observe was things happening that were pointing in the same direction. Right? They were fixing up their downtown. Why? Because they thought, okay, if step 3 works of our informal plan, then this will be useful also to capture more of the money, more of the revenue of the tourists. I mean, if all the shops are up the mountain, that's not so useful. But if there is something here to work with, a nice little downtown, okay, more people can stay here. We can lobby better with the resorts, with the investors there, and so forth. So that wasn't one example we really liked. Smithers in BC, also unlikely place for an IT community. Also, one reason why we really like that, and our opinion is not important here, but I'm just saying that we just happen to be impressed with that, is that they did not follow the textbook also regarding innovation. They didn't try to turn the area into a new Silicon Valley, but they did think, many of those guys, many of those IT guys, they also like hiking and skiing and this and that. And it's also, not too far even from the ocean. So they also focused on heritage, downtown preservation, trails, tourism promotion, high-speed internet, some third spaces, like basically just coffee shops also that were subsidized in the beginning. And then, hiring specialized firm to promote the place in that community. And again, this is not about attracting millions and millions or one big fish, but it seems to have worked. There's tourism. There is a small but stable IT community that seems to be resilient and so forth. An example that was not so successful. I mentioned it before, and I don't want to upset those people because we use it maybe too often as a negative example. Is the Crow's Nest Pass in southern Alberta, where they tried some reinvention, radical, but maybe too radical. So you got backlash. The next local elections, who was voted in? 70, 80-year-old former miners. So we met people from the council. The guy was 82 years old, was meeting us in his mining uniform of a mine that was closed 40 years ago. How is this going? How is this going to work? I mean, this is not. Again, trying to evaluate good and bad examples, in our view, that was something very, very tricky. Also because they forgot, for example, in Crow's Nest Pass, that the provincial government had already bailed them out before, had spent millions of dollars cleaning up the whole environment, so possibly something different could happen later. That was not acknowledged at all. No, the province was just annoying. That's it. So anyway, those are a few examples I can mention. Thank you.
Another question down here.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Craig Pollard. I'm the CEO of Municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador. I have a lot of questions for you, but we're meeting tomorrow, so
Yes,
I'll leave
thank
most
you.
of them till then. I'll only ask you
Just
one
ask one
today.
easy one.
I'll ask the easy one now, yeah.
Thank you.
I was struck by your comments about, and it relates to the last question, or your last example anyway,
Yeah.
your points around the actors and the narrative up to that point and how it influences where you go forward.
Mhm.
And we're going through a process. Our organization started it maybe 10 years ago, and it's happening now, at looking at regional government in this province. And a lot of the discussion has been about structure and function and that sort of thing, which is all interesting and needs to be done. But there's some underlying things that aren't really being discussed. One of which is, from my perspective anyway, I've been doing this work now for 17 years. From my perspective, most councillors in this province, there's 276 municipalities, most see their main role as lobbying their MHA for more money or help for their municipality, as opposed to providing solutions, coming up with strategy, planning. Most of them would say, I got no time to plan. I was elected to get things done, not to spend time planning. And in fact, we just had a regional meeting in Grand Falls, Windsor. We were talking about asset management. And one gentleman stood up in the back of the room and said, this is all well and good, but unless your town voted for the government, you're not getting any money.
Yep.
So there is, from the community side,
Yep.
there is a history, and it goes way back to how we set our municipalities up. There is this inertia towards your role being, as a elected municipal official, to lobby for favors from the provincial government. That's your primary role. From the provincial government side, we have had up till now a very limiting parental sort of approach. The legislation is very parental and parochial. And the approach to how the provincial government deals with municipalities has been very handle with kids' gloves. They're not that sharp. Make sure they don't, just protect them from themselves, sort of thing, right? So I'm really struck by you. I'm hoping your ideas on how do you break that particular narrative? How do you? 'Cause we're doing some things, but I'm sure half of what we're doing is wrong. But we're doing things. I'm really interested in your thoughts on that one slice of this whole reinvention, adaptive governance approach, which I find fascinating. But how do you turn that narrative in a practical way?
Well, I have no direct answers. I would say that one reason why for us Newfoundland is so interesting is that for us as outsiders, again, there's so much expertise here. There seem to be so many assets and so many possibilities, while the structures to take decisions and even the units that could take decisions don't seem to be there, and people do feel that there's very good reasons for those structures with those units. Now, thinking of reinvention and trying to link to your comment, again, I think this really comes out of more local analysis and local knowledge like you have. But just from the few things that I know, I don't really think that a starting point would have to be a new strategy, but probably fighting on different fronts at the same time, trying to tell different stories at the different levels at the same time. So because those roles are, okay, partly formalized, but at the same time, what mostly keeps those roles in place are just identity stories. We are a municipality, as you point out. This is what we do. I also hear a lot of discussion on service provision. Again, I don't think this is good or bad to see that as a definition of the municipality. If that is the main thing, then we will act as a municipality in a certain way. The province will probably also act in a certain way, and then the path moves in a certain direction. But you can also say, okay, municipality can also be something for political representation and lobbying beyond money for the services. It can also be, goal setting, basically. What are public goods? What are common goals for a community? What type of place do we want to be? And then we use whatever formal, informal tools to get there. Then again, people define themselves however they want to. If many of the locals don't even like the idea of a local government, and certainly not the idea of a local government that has to do all these things, because then it's going to be difficult to achieve some of those public goods or common goals that many of the observing academics really like. I mean, most of the literature on community development starts from the idea of municipality as a political community that has a will, that has an image of what they want to be in the future, collective goal setting, moving in a direction. But if you start with the idea of, it's service delivery, or even, minimum service delivery that is obliged, and then we pick and choose the things that we want, and we'll organize that ourselves, and we want to avoid taxes at all costs. I'm not picking on Newfoundland here. I have in mind now also North Dakota, Missouri, where I did some work, many parts of the US where it's really like that too. So under those circumstances, again, I would guess, a new strategy is not the point, but together with that, together with renegotiating those roles, I think, yeah, trying to sell the story that a municipality can be something more than that. And I also understand, talking about redefining municipalities, like if, I mean, for modernist planners or public administration, public policy people, the solution would be very easy. Just get rid of all these small municipalities. And then people will complain for one generation. This is what happened all over Europe, by the way, also where I came from. People complain for one generation, and then after that, that new unit becomes the community, and that becomes the place where politics plays out, and then many of the problems just disappear because there's more money, there's more lobby power, there's easier infrastructure, and so forth. That is, of course, an authoritarian decision. That is true in Europe. In most parts of Europe, they did that. Now people are happy. In the 50s to 70s, when that happened, often people were not happy. So this is also a question of political capital, of course, as well. Now, one thing that I don't want to say too much, but you could also say part of the storytelling can also be, okay, you don't like this and that, but you do like a number of other things. The expectations that people have from government are also increasing, increasing, increasing. But if you want to achieve this versus that, you have very different organizational structures that can achieve this. If you want high-speed internet and water of a different quality and all, I mean, of course, there's more experience here. Then at some point, you would say adaptation. It looks like the governance structures somehow have to be adapted. I don't think that I or any outsider, should try to tell how to do that. But as an outsider, I think it's not so difficult to see that probably something has to happen with these governance structures, and as many of all of you know better than I do, but we talked to some of you already. Yeah, of course, another way out is just moving. That's also a form of adaptation, where then people start to identify with a different place. People, maybe lived in a small community in Newfoundland and had a certain picture, but then for whatever reason they moved to St. John or they moved to Alberta. After a few years, they have different expectations from government. They have different attitude to what the municipality is and should do, and so forth. So again, I'm really not trying to say what is good or bad here. I'm trying to follow, this perspective that we developed here. So no straight answers. I'm sorry.
I know Mike had a question, but I think there was one further down. There you go, and you were right out the first out of the gate.
So kind of building on Craig's question. So for communities that either are not interested in planning or just don't buy into that, are there sort of less threatening or even almost subversive ways to sort of start them doing some self-analysis?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think the strategy can have many forms. It can also be the proverbial napkin. That can be a spatial sketch on a napkin. But that can also be the basic strategy, like Revelstoke case. That was really in a bar in 1975 that the first version of that informal strategy came up. Nelson, BC, they did all kinds of things, but they hated planning. You could say they did their form of planning towards reinvention, but without planners, because they didn't like planners at all. Because planners just try to codify everything in zones, and they bring in bureaucracies from the other levels, and they're going to snitch what we're doing, even to the other levels. So, and then we even heard now, like, oh, everything was good in the 70s and 80s, but when we hired a planner, then things went wrong. Same thing for the, sorry, I'm coming to it. Same thing for the analysis. That can also have many forms, and I also think it's not good to follow any textbook there. Just say it can be a comprehensive planning / visioning process and so forth, but it could also be institutionalized as in bigger places than I would say as a separate council that is advising the city council. It could be some separate sessions that the municipality, the council organizes for that. It could start with a discussion in a local newspaper. It could be an open debate. It might also be possible to seize on a conflict that there is. Okay, guys, our water is polluted again by the mine. Isn't it time now to start a new conversation of where we would go? Not necessarily immediately to come up with new plans, formal strategies, change laws at all, but such a conflict could also be the beginning of new storytelling and a slow redefinition, slowly changing self-understanding, and then moving forward. And thinking of where I come from, where I grew up, that is in Belgium. I mentioned, the heavy hand of the national government in forced amalgamation. Well, what you could see is that after a few years in some of those cases, you saw other villages coming together voluntarily. Uh, and then say, look, what can we do together to avoid these guys coming in? And what you would see then in some cases was some form of sub-regional cooperation where they took care of some of the issues that was then an argument for the national government in the other cases to crack down on. So there I also would say, it's important to be adaptive. It's also really good to keep in mind the breadth of different forms of self-analysis there. It can also be, for example, something more participatory. It can be something more centralized, like in Revelstoke. It can be something short-term or really long-term. We take 3 years, and then we split it up in projects maybe, or we try to translate it into project. First we do this, then we find money for that, and so forth. It can also be more expert-driven, more local knowledge-driven. Um, that is also possible. It's possible that spatial planning, how to reorganize space there, is something important. It's possible that's not, and that just the agreement is we want to do something more with tourism. We start there. We come together in a year from now to see if something seems possible. We just talk to the neighboring communities, invite a few people from St. John's that we like, that we trust, to see what they want to, what kind of advice they have to give, and so forth. So the number of forms and shapes for that is also infinite. The main thing, in my view, is that there is something like a local self-reflection that is not imposed from the outside, and it is also more than just expertise that is developed, even locally developed. Like there's a little bit more, how do you say that, well-funded community. They have an ecologist and a hydrologist, and they have an infrastructure engineer and so forth. So if they come up with expertise-driven elements of this new plan, that's also probably going to be problematic. One, because these guys and ladies don't agree with each other, probably. The expert doesn't exist. They all disagree with each other. And two, because that is still not self-analysis. There's still no ground, no basis there for the community to move in a different direction. So the choice of the forms, the appropriate forms of the self-analysis, has to come out of the first steps, I would say. If there is no planner there, okay, then don't suppose that there is a planner. If there is no money and interest in a long participatory process, then don't do it. If there is a local elite that is very much trusted, and that is, even if half of them is elected and the other half not, if they're trusted and that's what the community wants, then they probably have to do something or have to be convinced, that it might be the time to rethink the place. So again, that will have to be different in every case. That's my perspective on it.
And Mike?
Thank you. Mike Clare, a private citizen, formerly of the Harris Center. Thank you, Kristof and Monica and Leith, for an excellent presentation. I think you're talking about an issue that is very foremost in the minds of people of the leadership of this province, so this is very useful. I have a comment and a question. The comment is about path dependency. right? So we are the totality of our memories and our histories and all that. It's like we put the needle in the groove of the LP, and it keeps going around, and it stays in the groove unless something happens, right? Unless, oh my God, I'm diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. And then you can hear the needle scrape across the grooves, right? Or you discover, oh my God, we're pregnant, right? The needle goes. So you can change the narrative, and it's a way of framing it, right? So I think that the job of leadership is to reframe stuff so that people see it from a different light and be able to change. My question is about there's no formula, and I think at some point, so we're talking high level here. We're talking about people with lots of skills and lots of adaptability and nimbleness, going in front of a group and being able to move, the discussion around. But at some point, things have to be democratized more. Things have to go, to a lower level, right? To people who don't have that expertise. And that's where the formula, I think, there needs to be some formulas involved in this. And I look at Robert's Rules of Order as kind of being a formula for making people behave in a group, right? So at some point, some of this stuff may need to be translated into a formula. I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, in fact, I do agree with that. I just think that there's no general formula for adaptive governance or good governance. You also have a lot of, don't do corruption, blah blah, and so forth, and that's then good governance. Well, yes and no. Same for adaptive governance, resilience, sustainability, all these things. But I do agree with you that that doesn't mean that everything has to be unstructured. I don't believe in best practices as such, but some things might actually be useful, what another place did, or a certain way of organizing yourself, and so forth. I don't think, for example, that there is an optimal role or structure of a planning department or a public works department. I don't think it's very problematic to start thinking from there. On the other hand, you can see, okay, those guys in Nova Scotia, they seem similar in these respects. They found money there. We can do that. So we can follow that little formula that is more localized and context sensitive and so forth. Same thing for the Robert's Rules of Orders. I don't think that's a very way of organizing meetings, to be honest. That I'm not Anglo-Saxon in origin, and for me this is very, very intimidating too, and very cumbersome. On the other hand, I do believe without any doubt that it can be really useful in cases where some form of order has to be imposed, and that it might be really the good thing to do, maybe to go a little bit overboard with the structuring of the interactions in meetings and so forth. So yes, I do agree there, and in my view, that would come under this little heading of the learning, not only from our own past, but from different theories that might be good and so forth. For example, under the heading theories there, it could be, yes, why not do something under the heading of innovation? Again, I don't think there's a general formula to become an innovative community, or that doing that is the best way forward for every community. But I do think, there's certain way to focus on innovation that might be appropriate in this case. Okay, and then you can copy maybe 2/3 of that package that seems to have worked under similar conditions. And if people really identify with that and want to move forward, like in the case of Smithers, they didn't, I don't think they followed any book or management guru of innovation. They just thought, these IT guys, they seem to like hiking here and so forth. And then they start building from that. And then afterwards, of course, there were people saying, look, this is the innovative community and so forth. And then it became a textbook example. But I would say this is interpretation afterwards. I mean, it's not wrong, but I think I agree with what you're saying. It's just more, I think these import of certain formulas and structures have to follow self-analysis already, and did it really work there? Is the place really similar? Do we really want this? And then we can follow that that formula, so to speak. That would be my take on it. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, just 1 second, Monica. I'll get you the mic.
Sorry, I just wanted to add something very briefly to that. We haven't, Kristof mentioned it briefly, but sorry. One of the things that we also noticed that has often been like underestimated is the role of leaders and the different roles that leaders take. You know, so especially in small communities, when we start, asking many ways, so who was participating here, who was there, and often people cite, yeah, the council or the mayor, and then when you dig a little bit deeper, then you realize that there are some characters in the community that just move from being the mayor to being in the council to being the head of the business, and they play a huge role in stimulating the community and pushing forward. And as Kristof mentioned somewhere in the presentation as well, it's not always clear and explicit, and it's not always so democratic, let's say. So they sometimes, we've been also told by them, these people themselves, well, actually we kind of went against a little bit against the current here, but that was necessary because we saw things that were important, that it was a little bit of a gamble, of course, and there are risks to be taken, but that role of the leader of taking it's kind of like a hidden role of taking these of pushing things in a certain direction, and coercing, like coordinating, that seemed to be very important as well. And yeah, it's good also to recognize in that self-analysis.
Yeah, I completely. Yeah, very much agree with that, and then also linking to the adaptation. I mean, Monica and I and the colleagues in the team, among others, Leith Deacon, who also helped, of course. Uh, yes, if you see democracy as everybody doing exactly the same thing and having exactly the same input in decision making, then this will probably not work. This will probably not work, as in radical democracy as deciding together on everything with radical participation in 50 sessions where, okay, today we're going to talk about environment, tomorrow about infrastructure. That's probably not going to work under those circumstances if some kind of reinvention is wanted, I would say. At the same time, this leadership has to be rooted still in the community too. If the community doesn't really accept what they say, then at some point they're still going to move in another direction. Then one last point related to the leadership, indeed, something like that, reinvention strategies in adaptation is risky for everybody, for community. It can fail. The process itself will come with a lot of tensions, probably conflict, and it's especially risky for the leadership. As you know, in Newfoundland too, but also I mentioned the example of the Crow's Nest Pass. There were big promises by a relatively young city council with more of the experts represented, and they hired more experts in the administration of the municipality. As I mentioned, next election, they were all booted out. I'm not saying that they were doing the right thing. This is not about saying, okay, the people are dumb at all. No, they clearly made some mistake because they were booted out. They did not really embed themselves well enough in the community. But of course, I would say as an outsider, this is really quite dramatic, because then the story that our future is just a new mine became more deeply ingrained. And then any new attempt to do something different is delegitimized from the start, because yeah, we already did that radical thing, and the experts we also don't believe anymore in, and so forth. So just building on what Monica mentioned. Other questions, remarks?
We've got one question online, and then Rob had a question in the room. So here you go.
Thank you. This comes from Ben Wiper, who made a couple of comments similar to Craig's question as well about how do we change a culture to allow for reinvention. But one of the parts of the question was, when the majority of municipal governments are volunteers, how and where are we expected to find the time, energy, and resources needed to reinvent?
Well, yeah, excellent questions. And it reminds me a little bit also of my own history, or not my own history, but my family history. So my father, my grandfather, and my great grandfather also up to the 12th century. No, this is not true. But great grandfather, they were involved in local politics, in council, and so forth. Just involved in local, and indeed that was all volunteering. It was smaller units. They didn't have the time and the energy for that. They also didn't really have the expertise. But if I take a step back and look at this long-term evolution, they adapted partly because they were forced to reinvent it. They also did it because new demands came up, new expectations from within the community, beginning with electricity, okay, who's organizing that, then water management, many other things, sometimes crisis, also sometimes leaders who retired, sometimes leaders who were voted out. So these changes, they can come from different directions. Then in terms of the capacity building there's also different ways forward there. Well, it's always possible to say, okay, it's good as it is, no need for reinvention. And if there is need for reinvention, I I don't want to dodge or hedge too much, but I would like to refer back to some of the other things I mentioned, and that is that the self-analysis can be something very informal. It can be something also in a small group, or an exploration of options. Okay, what else could we do? And the same thing for the strategy. Again, if I think back of my great grandfather, what was the big thing that he did with his council? That is, was attracting one little brewery in their village. And that was because they knew Freddie, who knew Billy, who had 3 villages away, already a brewery. And then the guy from the Farmers Union also had a little bank and knew another guy from the Farmers Union, that so they could give more easily a loan there, and so forth. And that one brewery attracted another one, and so forth. I'm not saying that my great grandfather was a genius there in any sense, but just that this self-analysis and strategizing, can also take very everyday and informal forms. And it's really knowing the networks, knowing the situation. And then linking back one more time to the idea of leadership, I would say there also that leadership usually knows the networks better, and also knows better the informal institutions, or the relation between formal and informal. Look, at the provincial level, this party is in charge, or this person is minister of that. But at the same time, we can still sell this story, or reframe the story so it's more palatable to get some support for part of what we have in mind. We can find maybe some support in the region itself, and so forth. It's also possible to play with an idea for a while. Okay, we want to attract the big brewery. If there's not so much invested really in formalizing the self-analysis in the strategy, then it's also easy to drop to drop the idea as well. Again, this is not always about creating new bureaucratic structures and so forth. If there is, after self-analysis, the feeling, okay, we miss one piece of expertise, if there is an agreement that, okay, we do need an environmental planner, and that can open up different avenues for our community. Okay, if that is already like a partial conclusion, then you can say maybe we need to find some support, either a consultant, or if there's more structural support, hire one person who can do that, or first bring in someone for a year, like in Nelson, the planner. They brought in a planner who was not a planner. That was also less threatening. Then they brought in a planner for 1 year, and then they hired one, permanently. Okay, and then they kind of regret it. So maybe that's not a good example. But just to show that, again, this does not have to be like a very elaborate organizing or absorbing a lot of resources from the start. Yeah. I don't know who to look at because they're online. Yes.
One is some of this approach is quite consistent. I think some of the strategic planning and doing technique called strategic doing, which I think is quite adaptable to what Kristof's approach is. Don't take set organization, a long-term strategic plan, and then try to change everything. It's actually a much more nimble, active approach. You can use best practices or across the province can still hear me. Sorry, mic was off. I won't repeat all that, but what we did try in Newfoundland some time ago was a much more formal, pan-provincial, systematic, comprehensive, state-endorsed when we set up the regional economic development boards. And there was an intensive task force, the federal and provincial governments and municipal through their umbrella and community, etc. And there was some political support and some bureaucratic support, and it got implemented. And it was a fundamental, and we thought we were sneaky enough that we could do it and get buy-in, and it lasted quite a while. But it really flew in the face of the narrative and the culture of top-down, paternalistic patronage, large P politics, patron-client. It didn't try to replace all that, but it was establishing an alternative, bottom-up, systematic approach, and we lost. And that doesn't mean it goes away forever, and there's lots of learnings, and it now is part of the narrative that can be referred to. But maybe, and Mike was getting at it, and I think Craig, the reframing, maybe we don't be so explicitly, systematically, comprehensively trying to change everything. But if you reframe, and there are examples around the province, the Bonavista Peninsula stuff that's going on now around heritage and food and lifestyle, really. Bombay leveraging the national park around arts and culture. I know an example from Norway where, the management of the fishery is a vicious issue in this province, and it's not much easier there. And municipalities, even though they have a much stronger role in Nordic countries, never really had an explicit role in fisheries management. They reframed their endless failing fight to have a formal role in the fishery to coastal zone management, where municipal coastal responsibility was a natural, obvious angle into fisheries management. So thinking obliquely, change the terms of reference. And I think leadership can do that. Old leadership, not old in age, but old in the traditional approach, because we have a lot of young leaders in this province adopting the old ways of patron-client, backroom politics. So whatever the age, trying to lead that kind of, does that make any sense? And do you have any other examples?
Yeah, I mean, of course, you know those processes and the province much, much better than I do. But there's two things about the economic development boards, and then the other thing about the different local regional experiments. Well, one, it looks like the problems or the issues with those economic development board didn't stop the other experiments. So apparently there's still space and motivation for that. You can also say the very lightly institutionalized local government. A positive of that is that it is easier to experiment, to do really different things, build different structures around different topics and different ways of bringing in money or people. And then maybe for the other places to learn from that at some point, maybe for the province to come back and say, okay, some of the things we should generalize and could generalize. Then regarding the economic development boards, and I'm very hesitant to talk about that again because I know it's very prickly and I don't know so much about it. But one impression, again, you can all shoot at me, but one impression that I have is that the compromise that came out seems to have been that the expectations from different sides were maybe too high compared to the resources and the power that they were endowed with. So it's kind of, it looks to me again as outsider like they were allowed to play around for a while, but not really giving money or power. And then, you know, if one started to complain, then the other would jump on that. If that started to complain, then the other would jump on that. Again, you know, this is just the impression I have at this point, but and so I mean, you already mentioned it, and colleagues already mentioned it. I think, yeah, I mean, it would be a pity if that experience then becomes a big obstacle for any intervention or initiatives from the provincial government, because again, as an outsider, I would say this cannot be purely bottom up. This cannot, I mean, there have to be, and there are, of course, you know, people working at these different levels at the same time. And I would say, but I think you're doing that, and of course, much better than I could, reframing the story of that experiment, so people don't, you know, too easily draw the conclusion, oh, look, you know, we shouldn't do anything remotely similar in the future, because indeed, as you said, many things seem to have worked. And also the reasons why it didn't work is probably not because that form of organization was bad, or because the substance, the focus points were bad. Looks like, you know, there was something from the beginning with the conditions for that thing to function, and it seems to be associated also with a fear for regional level governments. You know, are they going to use that to build a regional government that is then going to replace the municipalities, or an arm for the province to push us more? Or again, those are impressions. So then, again, just, you know, my observations here, not just mine. Of course, talked a lot to Monica, and is that, you know, the memory and the retelling of the lessons and the histories of that experiment seems really quite important. So to maintain the option or preserve the option, you know, to come back later and do something like that. Again, you know, the Newfoundland expertise is here in the room. So yes. Okay, sorry.
We've got about 5 minutes left, so we can take another question if there is one. It's been a really, I think, rich discussion. So if there are no hands popping up, we can probably wrap it up. I would like to say a special thank you to Kristof and Monica as well. And of course, Inigo, who was fantastic and such a cooperative little guy. You did a great job, buddy. We do have a copy of the presentation we can email out to people who've registered for the event. If you came and you didn't register, which is also fine, just drop me an email or drop the Harris Centre at mun.ca an email and request that you get a copy as well. And we can put that out probably on Dropbox link or something like that. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming.